interacted with metaphysics and shaped it throughout history. I did my doctoral thesis in Tasmania, the University of Tasmania. That's where I grew up. And the topic was, some of it was Aquinas, some of it was a theologian called John Milbank, that was in philosophy. And I focused on a concept called participation, which is something that Aquinas uses heavily. And so the good thing about me taking this topic, metaphysics, is that I sort of live and breathe this area a lot, think about it a lot. I've been thinking about it for a couple of decades now. I really first got into philosophy when I first went to the University of Tasmania, I don't know, 20 years ago, more of that. And there was one of the chaplains there was an Opus Dei fellow priest, Joe Martins. He got me into Aquinas and Gilles Son and those guys, and it sort of went from there. So tonight, I've got a lot of ingredients here. I won't be able to have them all. I won't be able to cover everything tonight, but what I want to do is first give you a little bit of background context to where Aquinas is coming from. What I really want to drive home is that Aquinas, he's a very original thinker, but he doesn't think in a vacuum. There's all sorts of influences coming to him. All the people that lived, all the thinkers, theologians and philosophers that lived in these Middle Age times, they all thought of themselves as continuing the tradition of Augustine. So whereas now looking back, we tend to contrast Augustine and Aquinas to say they've got different emphases, but at that time, everyone was really commentating on Augustine. The other thing that I haven't mentioned here, there was a guy called Peter Lombard. I think it was about a century before Aquinas. He's important because he sort of collated together all the sayings of the church fathers and put them together in this book called The Sentences of the Fathers. And that the format that he had in that book and the sorts of questions that he put in that book really set the tone for all the questions that were that the theologians would deal with in the Middle Ages. So you'll find all of these masters would have a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard. But I'm just trying to get through this quickly. You've basically got two, besides Christianity, you've got two main tributaries that are coming into Aquinas' thought, and that's the work of Plato and the work of Aristotle. And it is true that Aquinas is very much an Aristotelian thinker who synthesizes Aristotle with the Christian worldview and tries to use the concepts of Aristotle to make sense of Christianity as well. But sometimes it's forgotten that he's just as much a disciple of Plato, and actually Aristotle in his own way is a disciple of Plato, although he does modify some parts of Plato. So I'm going to do something which is quite difficult, is to try and summarize Plato's thought in 5 minutes for you so that we can move on to Aristotle, okay? If you want to understand Plato, you have to appreciate this idea of what an essence is, okay? So when we think about, for example, a triangle, we think about what's the essence of a triangle. How would you define a triangle, anybody?
Three sides in an enclosed space plus having three angles.
That's very close to it. I think that's probably right, yes. I'm not a mathematician. But, or what about a human being? How would you define a human being?
Flesh.
Flesh, yeah. Is that all?
Individual subsistence of a rational nature.
Very good, very good. So, starting from back with Socrates, in the dialogues that Socrates had with the people around him, which are recorded in Plato's writing, Socrates is always asking questions about what is the essence of such and such? What is the essence of justice? What is truth? And what they're trying to do is get at what is it to be a human being? What is it to be virtuous? Okay? Trying to get into the essence, and trying to remove the things that are extrinsic and accidental. Okay? So Plato was interested in what is the fundamental core of what makes something what it is. And for him, it's the essence of a thing. And now here's his thought process. Am I loud enough, by the way? His thought process is that in this world, in the material world, things are changing all the time. So they don't really coincide with themselves, and they don't remain themselves eternally. So something becomes a plant, and it falls away and is no longer a plant because it corrupts. Same with animals. But for something to really be, it should be lasting. So for him, change is something that's imperfect, whereas what the being of something is, it's everlasting and it stays the same. So with Plato, we get this idea that the pure idea of something is everlasting and it can't be corrupted and it doesn't change. All right? And in a certain, if you think about it, it makes sense, because can I change what the essence of a triangle is? Nobody can. It's just what a triangle is, just is what a triangle is, right? The other day, my daughter asked me, it was quite an intelligent question. She asked me, could God make a human person without a soul? What do you think my answer was?
Was it a journalist?
Oh, very good. Or a lawyer. So the answer is no, right? Which raises an interesting question, because that seems to limit God's power. So you've got these essences, what it is to be a human being, what it is to be a horse, what it is to be a triangle, and they're just there permanently. And even God cannot change what those are, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Fast forward to Descartes. He thought, no, God is more powerful than that. God can actually change the essences. And he believes that if God wanted to, he could make 2 + 2 = 5. Right. But we're going to reject that view. That's not right. There are essences. And when God creates things, and when we create things, we have to fit in with what the essences are. So there are these relations between things, necessary relations between things that set how reality works. Okay? That's what you get from Plato. And all those essences they exist in this eternal realm. And in order to intuit those essences, those ideas, we have to use our intellect. We have to transcend, go beyond the sensible world, the world that we can see and feel and touch, in order to have an intuition to this heavenly realm where all the truth is just there, eternally unchanging. Okay? So you've got a hierarchical vision of the universe in Plato. You've got the sensible world, physical things where change occurs. And then you've got this interval, and then you've got the heavens. In the heavens are all the ideas. You've got the perfect man, the perfect horse, the perfect anything, dog, perfect triangle, just all sort of subsisting there. And then above that, you've got what he calls the good. And the good is, in some ways, his version of what we say is God. The good is infinite light, and all the ideas participate in that light. And for Plato, the good, everything participates in the good, and when we see something that's beautiful, we are reminded of the good. And our attraction for beauty is caught up with our desire for the good. Okay? So that's what I wanted to drive home there with Plato. You've got the good, ideas, sensible world. Now, then you've got Augustine, who comes along, 4th century, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, fourth.
Yeah. He takes Plato. He doesn't take much Aristotle at all, because at this time they've only got the logical works. All the other works, like the metaphysics, the physics, the psychology, are not really in the West yet. They haven't been translated. And then later on, what happens is, as the Muslims expand after Muhammad comes and spreads his religion, we actually lose all these works until later on in the 11th century, because of the Crusades and other things that are going on, we get back all these works because they've been translated into Arabic. And so they're translated back into Latin, and then that's how they start to appear back in the Latin Christian West. And St. Albert the Great was first. That was Aquinas' teacher, another Dominican. And that explains why there's so much emphasis on Aquinas as being the first major synthesizer of Aristotle and Christianity. It's because while there were other works by Aristotle in circulation, the others weren't really there yet. Okay. Where was I? Augustine. So he knows about the categories. The categories of Aristotle is where you get the idea of your substance and the 9 accidents. Okay. And he does use a bit of that to try and make sense of the Trinity. But he very much is in a Platonic framework. He does Christianize it a lot. And what was I going to say about that? Yes. So the ideas, with Plato, remember, we've got these subsisting ideas just sitting there, existing in themselves. That doesn't really work for a Christian, because that means that there's something eternal that's independent from God. So what Augustine does, he says, well, they're actually ideas of God. They exist in God as his ideas. Okay, so he sort of makes that shift. And the other thing that's really important is that Plato's got this idea of participation. So every individual member of a species, so a human being, every human being participates in the pure idea of a human person. Every dog participates in the ideal dog. Every act of justice participates in perfect justice, which are all the ideas. Participation, what does that mean? Well, it means to take part in. 2 things going on there. One is you are receiving that reality. You have it in a derivative and dependent fashion. And also, it's less perfect. So Plato is really driving home that perfect justice is something in the heavens, but in earth, we only have imperfect reflections of justice. And the same with all the other things that are participated in with human being, dogs and so forth. But this idea of participation is one of these really fundamental concepts that is used to make sense of a lot of things. So Augustine takes that, and Aquinas in turn, he takes this idea of participation and he uses it to make sense of all sorts of things, including in metaphysics, so how things exist, and also in epistemology, which is how we know things. All right. So what I'm trying to do here is just show you that there's all these historical connections going on, and so that when I give you all these concepts, you understand that you didn't just come up with these out of nowhere. They have a history. We've got here. And then there's this Neoplatonism. What happens in Neoplatonism is the attempt to make Plato's philosophy something more systematic, and it's going to incorporate epistemology, ethics, mysticism, metaphysics within that total worldview. And the main proponent of that, the father of Neoplatonism, is a guy called Plotinus. And instead of talking about the good, he talks about the one. We've got the one at the top, sort of his version of God. Then you've got the logos. The logos. You all know what logos means. Translates as word or mind or account. So the idea there is that you've got the one at the top of the hierarchy of being. That sort of emanates out the logos. And the logos is mind, and that's where all the ideas are. Then you've got this other level, which is life, and then under that, you've got all the material beings around us. You've got this other thing called Neoplatonism, which is just an intermediate stage. All right. Was there a... I thought that was a mouse. It's not a mouse. Okay.
Ongoing joke.
All right. Any questions about that bit? What I didn't really talk about is how important the church fathers are for Aquinas, particularly Augustine, like I said. Augustine and Aquinas are the two big giants. But he's also drawing on sometimes the Eastern fathers, such as Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, Maximus the Confessor, I believe, yes. And obviously Scripture and Magisterium, but even how to read Scripture is filtered through the fathers. All right. So just to repeat that point, there's two things you've got to keep together in your mind, is that Aquinas is an original thinker, but he's at the same time very much a traditional person. He's drawing on all these traditions, just as the people before him did. And you've got...
Brendan,
yeah.
sorry, that little bit there, where you said logical works and...
Ah, yes, that's...
Can you just explain that again?
Yeah, sure.
Were you saying Aristotle's works weren't available?
Yeah, so
in the
Aristotle's...
world?
You can sort of divide his works into two types. One's the logical works, which are basically the tools you need to think well, called the organon, which means an instrument. And one of those is called the categories. And the categories talks about all the different senses of being. Different senses of being. And what's interesting about that is that for Aristotle, if you list out all the different senses of being, what we mean by being, that corresponds with how all the different ways that being is in reality. There's this mirroring relationship. All the other works, I put them here. I'm not going to give you all of them because I can't remember all of them. The physics, which is what Father Ledinich was talking about. Metaphysics. You've got works on cosmology, to do with the planets, meteorology, psychology, which is to do with living things, on the interpretation of dreams. So these were sort of there quite early for the people in the West. When I say the West, I mean the Latin-speaking church, whereas these had to come later. And that's why it's such a big event when they came into the West. It's like, what do we do with this? And the church wasn't sure about it. Are you aware of this? The church wasn't sure what to do with Aristotle. They were suspicious. And what happened at that time, you really had three schools. You had Aquinas, was like this middle position to do with Aristotle. You had the you had what you might call the die-hard conservatives, who would just say, no, we're following Augustine, we're going to stick with Scripture, Augustine, none of this modern Aristotle, okay? And there were reasons for that. Because Aristotle did have some edgy ideas, and some adjustments had to be made. So you could say that the focus for these guys was more on the theological, the Scripture and grace. The Verists, remember how Father Leibniz was talking about the two books? You've got the book of nature, which includes philosophy. The Verists were very much into the book of nature, and they would follow Aristotle in everything. Aristotle was like the Bible for them, the truth. So in the universities at that time, the people in the arts department, you would find these guys, the Verists.
Were they Christians though?
Some of them, yes. Well, yes, because we're talking about Paris and Naples. They would have this weird theory where you'd have two truths. You'd have what Scripture says, that's true. What Aristotle says, that's true. They contradict, but that's just the way it is. And I can't remember what his name was, but there was a bishop who came out and condemned some of these statements. So you see how you've got these opposite relationships to Aristotle? This is sort of an extreme, a more extreme rejection of Aristotle. Just stick with the old ways. We love Aristotle so much. We think he's the best. He's our guru. Aquinas is this middle position. And that's turned out to be quite reasonable and works quite well and has turned out to be very fruitful for the church. So that's why the church recommends it. Although at the time, there was some controversy over whether Aquinas was coming under the condemnation of the bishop, because he put out some statements condemning certain views. Some of the views were, I can't remember, you probably can remember this better than me, but...
the reformity, multiple forms.
Yes. So, one of them was the eternity of the world, and it's to do with what the Catholic Church wanted to emphasize is that God did not have to create the world, and that didn't just necessarily emanate from God. The Verists also believed in there's only one intellect that all humans have. The other one is that the world is eternal. And because some of these condemnations looked like they might be condemning Aquinas for a while, it wasn't clear what was going to happen there, but he was eventually beatified and canonized. All right, so that's the context. I'm going to move on now. I'm going to step back to metaphysics now. First, I'm going to do Aristotle's metaphysics. A lot of that comes over into Aquinas. He adds some other things and makes some adjustments, but a lot of it's carried over. So let's first talk about the word metaphysics. Aristotle never uses that word. The reason we have that word is because after Aristotle died, someone had collected, I can't remember if it was his own notes or Aristotle's writings, he collated them together, put them in books, and the last book that was in that series, he just called the Metaphysics because it came after the physics. And that was a pedagogical decision. The decision was that it's best to study the metaphysics, it's best to study this stuff after the physics. And Father Leibniz has explained why. It's because we have to first experience things through the senses, and then from there we can abstract, transcend higher towards the higher things, and arrive at metaphysical and purely spiritual realities. So, if you think of a hierarchy again, you'll come across this a lot in ancient and medieval work, this idea of a hierarchy, and I think it's right. You've got spiritual or immaterial this hierarchy of being. Less perfect or less noble is the word they use, and more perfect, more noble. And this is considered to be more intensely actual, more intensely real, in a sense, and the material less so. Okay, and this is an important truth. This is an important relation we've got here. For the ancient Greeks, and I think they got this right too, to be and to be true are convertible. So, to the extent that something is real, to that extent it's intelligible and true. Because spiritual and material things are more intensely real, they're more intelligible in themselves. So when we consider them in themselves, God and angelic things and ideas, in themselves they're more intelligible. However, from our perspective, they're obscure. So from our perspective, and that's because we're embodied human beings, not only are we not God, we're not angels. Because we use our senses to think, the things that are more intelligible to us are actually more obscure. We have to begin here and ascend upwards. So, the order of being, in the order of being, this is first and this is second. So spiritual being is primary, more perfect, whereas material, secondary. But in the order of knowledge, you start here and work your way up. It goes the opposite way, okay? And I want to relate that back to the word metaphysics. So metaphysics includes this stuff. It's not just this, but it includes this. It's about the first things, but we have to deal with them last because we start here, right? So metaphysics deals with the things that are first in reality, but those things come last in our knowledge, all right? Any questions?
Facebook recently changed their name, didn't they, to Meta or something? Does it Meta mean death?
No, meta just means after or taking a step back. It's one of those Greek prefixes that just does different things. So, yeah. Any question? Okay. So that's what the word metaphysics means. And someone, it was you, let's remember that, question about what is being qua being, and this is very difficult. Being as being, or being qua being. And this is what Aristotle's interested in metaphysics. But to answer the question of what does it mean to be, he takes this convoluted path through the metaphysics and deals with all sorts of things, all this stuff. But I want to try and give you a bit of a tourist guide of what's going on in that book. All right. First thing you need to know is that what is the object of this science? Remember, we talked about science. Science in the old sense is a systematic study, of things that can be known for certain.
Certain knowledge,
Certain
causes.
knowledge. And it's theoretical rather than practical, okay? And so we want to know causes. Aristotle's interested in the causes and principles of being, all right? This is fairly easy to understand. This this is difficult. Right? What's that all about? Because it's so abstract. And I'm going to try and explain that to you by explaining what it isn't. Okay. Now, we take any narrow realm of entities. Let's say we come up with the science of living things. Let's say living things are a subset of all existing things, right? So if we restrict our science to the science of living things, if you make our object living things only, we're not doing metaphysics explicitly. We've got too narrow a range. So what we need to do is expand it so that we're covering everything. We want to know what is it that makes anything exist. We don't want to just know what it means to be alive, what it means to be an animal, what it means to be a plant. We don't just want to know what it means to move, to exist. We want to know what it means to be, all right? So what we're looking for, and I'm going to represent this with a cloud, because this is what Aristotle's doing in his book, the Metaphysics. We're looking for an understanding of being. And it has to be unified. Sorry, that's a bit... We want a single account or understanding or notion of being, right? That it can't be too restricted. I'm going to give some more examples of an account that doesn't work because it's too restricted. So before Aristotle, to recall what was mentioned in an earlier lecture, there were these pre-Socratic philosophers who would hypothesize that everything was water. And water was the fundamental element of reality. Everything was made up of water, basically, and it would transform. Or they'd say everything's fire. Then there were these atomists as well who came later. Would say everything is built up of these little atoms. And reality is just atoms moving about in space, okay? So, if you're Thales, I'll put the spelling up for you. The question, what does it mean to be? For him, the answer to that question is, well, to be is to be water. That's the answer, all right? But from our perspective, and from Aristotle's perspective, that's too narrow. It doesn't take account of all the phenomena, all the ways that things can be, right? For, let's say, Democritus, Lucretius, these are the atomists. They would say to be is to be, fundamentally, to be an atom or composed of atoms. Aristotle is not happy with that because Aristotle recognizes the fact that things have an irreducible unity form that can't be reduced to simply a collection of parts, a collection of atoms. So these guys are wrong in their answer to what it is to be because they leave out form. So when Aristotle tries to form his create his answer, form his answer to what is the meaning of being, he's looking at these and saying, well, that doesn't work. And it's something to do with form, basically, and essence. This focus on essence is something that comes from Plato. And form and essence are pretty much interchangeable. But what Aristotle does with form is not the same as what Plato does with form. How long have I gone so far, by the way?
7:37.
So remember I'm just going to take a step back and compare Plato and Aristotle on form. For Plato, the emphasis, and it's a very heavy emphasis, is that the ideas are the real things. Everything else that's below are very imperfectly existing. And they only exist by participating in these ideas. But to exist for Plato is to have a relationship with the forms. So you've got things existing here on Earth, and they have a relationship to something else. There's the forms, and this is a relationship with participation. Okay? Can anyone see a problem with that? Well, let's say we've got a rabbit here and a human here. Plato's view would be that this bit of matter here has a relationship to perfect rabbit idea in heaven. This bit of matter here has a relationship to the idea of man. They participate in their respective ideas, okay? Now, it seems as if that allows that it could have been the other way around. So this object could have been a man, this one could have been a rabbit instead. Okay? It doesn't allow, what Aristotle wants to say is that things are intrinsically, it's a component. He wants to say humanness is in the being. It's not a relationship outside and upwards. It's in the being, it's a component of it. Because that's the only way to make sense of what it is to be. And that's what he does with form. Form, he brings form down into the world, basically. So he gets rid of that participation idea. Gets rid of this idea of the forms being up there in the heavens, scraps that. He even scraps the idea of the good, doesn't like that. It becomes very much more worldly, less mystical, more empirical and scientific, I suppose, in the sense of being oriented to the sensible world. Any questions about that contrast between Aristotle and Plato and how they used form?
So could you go over why exactly would it be the case that if you participated in the perfect form, that means that you could theoretically be switched? I don't quite understand that. Why could the rabbit be switched?
Well, for Aristotle, that matter is combined with the rabbit form.
Oh, okay, right, yep.
So that matter sort of is actually taking its existence from the rabbit form. It's combined with it. And that's different from just having some extrinsic relationship to it. It's a much tighter unity. That's a question? Yeah.
So you're basically saying that because there's like the perfect form, like the matter doesn't really matter, I guess, in comparison to the like the perfect idea. Like the perfect idea is that idea, and it could show up in any different kind of way. Is that basically how I'm
Yeah, different ways of manifesting it, yeah.
Yeah, so it could theoretically just show up as like
Yeah,
a
yeah.
balloon or something.
Yeah, I mean, and also, there's also a difference between substance and accidents, and you can't make sense of substance and accidents that way either. I won't go into that. But anyway, just to trust me that you can make more sense of things if you do have this idea of form. I mean, if you don't have this idea of form, we don't have souls. If you don't have the idea of specific forms, then you can't make sense of how we categorize things into different types. Things have to be intrinsically such, intrinsically human, intrinsically horse. Otherwise, when we use our language, we're just imposing concepts arbitrarily on things. All right? Now, here's the plot twist. Aquinas agrees, yep, we need form. Form's intrinsic. But he also wants to agree with Plato at the same time and say things participate in order to exist. So, and this is hard to get your head around. What Aquinas is trying to do is combine that inside of Aristotle. Forms are in things as a component of things. He's also trying to say that individuals participate in God in order to exist. And he's trying to keep those two insights together. And that there is what, in my view, I would say that's the insight, that's the achievement of Aquinas in his metaphysics. All right? Don't be worried if you find that really hard to get your head around, because it is. I mean, even now it's something, it's hard.
So when you say Aquinas makes the two, is the participating in the, does that have anything to do with universals at all?
Yeah. They're not just that.
So you're saying the perfect ideas are God's ideas,
Yes.
and Aquinas is saying you have to participate in that to exist.
Yes, there's that as well. A lot of what Aquinas does, he tries to say that's true, but then he says, but also this is true. He's trying to take the best of both and say, yep. So, I don't think you covered it, but later on when we get to the Middle Ages, I'm not sure whether this is exactly the terms they use, but you get this idea that in God's mind, he's got these ideas, and they're exemplars. And Aristotle and then Aquinas uses this, well, Aquinas especially uses the analogy of an artist or an architect or a builder. And the architect has in his mind an idea of what he's going to build. He builds the house to conform to the idea he has in his mind. And that house is reflecting, participating in the idea. And when the house is finished, it's actual. Actual just means it's complete, finished. It is what it is. Okay? So Aquinas would say that the human form, for example, human form, but then you've got this divine idea of the human. Sorry. So, from all eternity, God is contemplating all possibilities. He knows he knows what he can make. He knows what he can do. And because he knows what he can do, what he can create, he knows this possibility. He knows what it is to be a human being. And as it turns out, he likes that idea. He decides, I'm going to make these. And when he creates Adam and Eve, the human race, got to speak in loose language here. He's consulting this idea. He's making Adam in conformity with his own ideas. So what's going on here is he's giving Adam a human form, and that human form is reflecting his the God's idea of it. Does that make sense?
I guess this is sort of might be going like go a bit too deep for it, but I guess with the intrinsic form there, you would say like an Adam and Eve kind of reflecting the divine idea. Is the reason we wouldn't actually be the proper divine idea due to original sin then, like the life of being Lord, or is it more just this is meant to be a descriptive?
No, it's not. It's not. I see where you're going with that. The divine ideas of God are in God because God is the subject of those ideas. Right? Just like your thoughts are in your mind, not in my mind. So, if Adam and Eve never sinned, they still wouldn't be the same as the divine idea. Because they're creatures. God's ideas are not creatures. They're just... There's actually no distinction between God and his thoughts, says Aquinas, and says Augustine. When we look at this, we make distinctions. We can sort of say, well, there's God, and there's his ideas, and we can distinguish that in our mind. But in reality, everything in God is God. Right?
Is this going back to that sort of simple and complex things?
Yeah.
Like God is like perfectly simple.
Perfectly simple.
Since we're meant to be
Yeah.
more complex, we can't actually be the same as idea.
That's right. If we were ideas, we would have to be God. We would have to be simple. Yeah. So what's going on is somehow there's a reflective relationship. So by giving us human form, we're reflecting his idea, his plan. And by being virtuous, we're reflecting his plan for how we should live. Yeah. I've lost my train of thought. What question do we have? Okay. Where I was at was trying to explain that Aristotle's taking the participation idea and the intrinsic form idea and trying to fit them together. I haven't yet come to the place where I can explain all that. But I want to wind back and go back to Aristotle and just look at what sort of things is he looking at in his metaphysics and why. So,
Sorry.
yeah.
Just a quick question. Can metaphysics exist without God?
Can there be metaphysics without God?
That's right.
Do you mean can an atheist do metaphysics?
So Aristotle, he, for what I understood, he takes away a little bit the concept of God.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yes. And we're talking here about metaphysics.
Yeah.
How can he?
Yeah, because Aristotle wants to study, when he's doing metaphysics, he doesn't use that term, but when he's talking about what's called the first science. It's the ultimate principles of a reality, right? Now, in order to come up with that science and start doing it, you don't necessarily have to have an accurate view of God, because that's what Aristotle would do. If you want to do metaphysics really well, you have to have a good concept of God, but Aristotle's concept of God was imperfect, so his metaphysics wasn't perfect. Does that answer your question? There's actually a broader sense of metaphysics that's used today. Metaphysics is just this philosophical study of reality, and that would include all those other things I talked about. Other things, all those topics like what is space, what is time, what is the human being made up of. When people say metaphysics today, they mean all that stuff. You can do metaphysics without believing in God, but I think if you're doing it really well, and you're consistent and you're honest, you should come to the belief that God exists. That's what I think anyway. But the thing is, in reality, it doesn't work like that. Depending on how culture affects people. People end up doing all sorts of philosophical projects and still deny that God exists. Just the way it is. So, how does Aristotle go about studying being? Well, he doesn't go at it directly. He makes all these distinctions, okay? So, I'm going to use the word differences here. And I'm going to use these words. So we've already covered this, is that for Aristotle there are different types of things with in different species. So you've got the different species of horse, different types of plants. Human being is another species, all right? A species is just a type of thing. It's important to emphasize here is that these are natural kinds. These kinds of things, they carve up reality. In reality, they divide reality. We're not imposing those divisions, those kinds, we're discovering them. All right? Now, to draw that point out more, we can come up with all sorts of categories and divide up the world in all sorts of ways. So I could think of the set. Let's think of the set of all entities in genera. Okay. Now that is not a natural kind because that's going to cover all sorts of things. We can think of all the sets of all things, which in English have a name beginning with the letter B. Right? That's not a natural kind. So our concepts don't always track natural kinds. So there's these differences, the difference between species or natural kinds. But you've got this other thing called modes. So actuality and potentiality, or what you could call modes of being. Now, Aristotle says that you can't really define actuality, you just have to give examples of it and hope with confidence that you're going to get the idea. So he gives examples like, I can be actually seeing, or if I'm not seeing but I have the power to see, I can be potentially seeing. A pile of bricks is potentially a house, when it's built it's actually a house. So, have you got the idea yet? Does it make sense? Yeah, it's one of those fundamental ideas, you can't really define it because it's fundamental. So, this is going to help have an account of what being is. This is important. We've already talked about this. This is part of the solution. This here is important too. So these are two modes of being. So we've got actuality and potentiality as modes. Think of these modes as you've got being, and then what Aristotle does is he sort of divides being in different ways at different angles. You can divide it into actuality and potentiality, or you divide it between substance and accident. Substance, remember, is something that can exist in itself as a subsisting thing independently, whereas an accident is always something that inheres in substance. So a colour doesn't just float around existing. 3 doesn't. It's always 3 somethings. Does that make sense so far? The substance accident? Okay. So, in his search for what's the meaning of being, he makes these distinctions between actuality and potentiality, substance and accident. Now, and what he says is that our account of being, our understanding of being, has to encompass both of those, because potentiality exists. All right? We have to say that potentiality occurs in reality, because if we didn't say that, you couldn't make sense of change. And also, when you talk about the human person, you have to affirm that a human person has certain powers. I've got the power to talk, I've got the power to read. Other spiritual powers like the power to will, to love, to walk around. From a supernatural point of view, the power to worship, the power to pray. These are powers to act. But we've also got these capacities to be acted on. So my body has got the capacity to be burnt, to be crushed, or my emotions. I have got the capacity to be made angry or made sad. So these are things that can happen to me. So potentiality covers all these things which I'm able to do or I'm able to undergo. And it's pretty clear that if you took away this, you can't make sense of reality. You have to have it. All right? Same here. Aristotle wants to say, well, our concept should cover those two as well. The next point nonetheless, while having a flexible concept of being, Aristotle wants to say this is primary, substance is primary. This is being in a primary sense or in a fundamental sense. This is derivative and secondary, okay? Accident, there is such a thing as accidental being, but it's derivative and secondary. To be a substance is primary, fundamental. And this is a tricky one. So, when Aristotle talks about a substance, there's two aspects to that. The first aspect is that it's an individual, a concrete, single, indivisible thing. The second is that it's a type of thing. It's got a specific nature, specific form. When Aristotle talks about a substance, it's never just a bare, naked substance. It's always a type of thing. So, if you've got to translate it to sort of an awkward English translation, substances are this and as such. It's this thing, this concrete thing, this individual, but it's such, meaning it's determinate, it's got a form. It's both of those at the same time. Same here. Actuality is primary for Aristotle. Again, his understanding of being has to encompass both. At the same time, he's saying this is primary. Now, it's primary in a few different ways. From our point of view, when we try and make sense of potentiality, Or is it going to refer to actuality? When we say something's in potential, we think, well, potential for what? We have to, in our minds, we have to look forward to what it's going to be, what it can be. So potentiality is not intelligible unless we refer it to actuality. Does that make sense, that point? Okay. The next point is that this is primary in reality. Why is that? Why is actuality primary? Well, that's whenever we say something is X, we're talking about its actuality. It is actually something. It's coinciding with a certain form. I'm finding it hard to explain why actuality is primary. It's just something quite fundamental.
I think people would appreciate that it's better to play the piano than to actually have the potential to play the piano, or to be a millionaire than to potentially be a millionaire.
Yes, thank you, yeah. So it's better and more real. And there is a tight relationship, a very intimate relationship between goodness and actuality. It's good. It's better. It's good that something is actually musical rather than potentially musical, or actually virtuous rather than potentially virtuous. And something I haven't really mentioned: teleology. So every specific nature has got its own teleological drive, and that is a dynamism or a thrust or an inclination towards its own perfection. So if you buy a baby pig and feed it, put it out in the field, it will grow into an adult pig and it will do pig things if it's allowed to be in the right environment. And that's the same thing is true of all the different animals. And the same thing with a child. The child's got this innate tendency to grow in the way it's supposed to, and act in the way it's supposed to. It's more complicated with human beings because we also need education and grace and things like that. So does it make sense how Aristotle wants to think of natures teleologically? Everything is supposed to be in a certain way. It's supposed to develop and grow and be in a certain way in order to be good, in order to be well ordered, what it's supposed to be. And you need teleology in order to make judgments about whether something's doing well or not doing well, whether something's healthy or unhealthy, whether something's good or bad, moral or immoral. Okay? Does that make sense? If you take away teleology, you don't have any of that.
Sorry, I think I missed it. What was the definition of
Teleology.
teleology?
So telos just means end. A teleological drive is a drive to perfection or fulfillment.
Is this its final cause?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. So in a horse embryo, there is this inclination in its nature to become a fully fledged horse. Fully fledged horse. Fledged means flying, doesn't it? fully grown horse. And horses will gallop around. Horses will eat grass. That's just natural for them. It's an unfolding of nature. Right, so teleology is the unfolding of nature as it's supposed to thrive. Okay. And what I said after that is that if you're going to make judgments about what's normal and abnormal, you need these concepts. All right. Yeah. I want to give an example there. How long was that?
8:05.
Right. So the DSM-4, are we up to DSM-5 now, I think? 5? Yeah, that's the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. So that's the whole list of all the different pathologies in psychology, okay? The problem with the psychology profession, if you're a materialist, if you don't have teleology, is that you can't really say objectively something's normal or abnormal. Your concept of what normal is, I'll ask the question, see if you can answer it. How would an atheist, materialist, psychologist answer the question of what normal is? What does normal mean to them? Subjective, yeah.
Well, they define it against the gold standard of themselves. They define it normal.
Yeah. Yeah, you could just say, well, how I live my life, that's normal. So if you're conforming with that, then you're normal as well. You see, that's not really a solid way of judging things, is it? What was the other option?
Well, it's just
Subjective,
subjective. Like, from my understanding, most psychologists will just say like, whatever makes you happy.
Yeah.
I guess.
Okay.
Like, it's like based on the individual's mind, like what they perceive to be right and wrong.
Yeah.
They don't actually seem to have a criteria.
No, they don't.
Okay.
It's very utilitarian
Not
and
even
functional.
like what you'd say socially acceptable, would they accept?
Yeah, you'd say if it's conforming with what's considered acceptable by the majority or by social forces or the media, that's one way of doing it.
Relativist.
It's
They're
a relativism. Yeah. Another way you could do it is statistically, how most people are. So if you're the same as most people, then that's normal. The problem with that is if you're in Nazi Germany and you're the only person resisting the Nazis, they're all normal, according to that definition, right? Or if everyone has a strange, what we call deformity in their feet, say club feet. If everyone's got that, or let's say 60% of people have got it, by that definition, that's normal. See how you need Aristotle to, you need some ideals, some telos to compare it with to say that's actually abnormal. Another way you can do it is you can use the evolutionary paradigm to say what's more likely to survive in an environment that's normal. So you could say if it's adaptive, then it's normal. And that's also relativist. Does that make sense? So if I'll give an example there. Let's say a mutation happens, some radiation event, nuclear fallout, and people start developing 6 fingers. And then that gets in the gene pool, and then the majority of people will have 6 fingers. And the people with 6 fingers are better at playing piano, and they've just got, this shows about this stuff, shows about mutants, right? You could say that that's more adaptive. You could say that's more adaptive. They've got advantages. If you take away Aristotle, you have to agree with that. If your view is simply that if you can survive better or get ahead better in society as it is, that's normal, then you have to say that mutations are normal. Could be normal. So if you have that view of Darwin, if you take Darwin strictly like that, and you take away any sort of reference to God or teleology, and Darwin pretty much gets rid of teleology. If you do that, your understanding of what's normal just collapses into what happens to be adaptive in an environment, and that could be mutations. And the danger of that is that you take away teleology, you've got no philosophical basis to resist transhumanism transhumanism is a move. Does anyone know what that is? Would anyone like to explain it?
Might have a guess. Is it where you think that you're, other than human?
Not quite.
I thought it was the idea of being able to like upload yourself into the matrix or the
Close.
or something.
Like cloning.
It's ability to enhance yourself in artificial ways. So you could manipulate your genes. I'm just sort of talking different sci-fi imaginative abilities here. So you could adapt your genes. You could put I think it's called a cyborg, someone who's got robotic things joining themselves. You could put little, and these exist. You have these little chips in your brain, and people have them, that can send out impulses to make you make your brain send out certain hormones, so that they're more active or less depressed or something. So it's one thing to use those to try and recover normal human function. It's another thing to say, well, let's go beyond what has been considered traditionally normal and try and enhance the human being. So it becomes a bit like trying to become God and create a human being beyond what we've been so far. That's transhumanism, trying to make us immortal or increase our abilities using artificial enhancements.
So pretty much it's dehumanizing.
Oh yeah, it is. You're right. It's transhuman, but because you're going beyond the natural teleology, you're actually denying your humanity. Yeah.
Taking away your
Yeah,
essence.
you're right. And what was my point? My point was, is if you do away with teleology, which we have, what society has, you've got no resistance to transhumanism. You don't have an argument against it, do you? You don't have an argument against transsexual changes either, really.
So the idea of natural is sort of dismissed, pushed aside. Is the word natural? A lot of people say, oh, it's not natural.
Yeah, well, the word natural, I mean, when you read Shakespeare, when he says something's unnatural, that means evil. That means totally disordered and repulsive. It goes against the universe if something's unnatural. That normative, morally loaded sense of nature, we don't really have that anymore, do we? I mean, people do. I'm just talking about culture at large. Yeah.
I think people have a bit of a sense of like, when they're up against something that, something happened at work the other week and people were forced to sort of act in a way that wasn't natural through this HR, this new sort of modes of HR deliveries. And they were they just wanted to sort of curl up and bury themselves in the ground because of the way that they were forcing us to deal with this meeting thing. It's like, this is really unnatural. And I think they have a sort of, can't quite explain it in a way that makes sense, but it felt very abnormal, very unnatural.
So that could be like this healthy, innate sense of what's ordered and what's disordered. The problem is that if we're not well formed in philosophy and in religion, that innate sense can be worn down.
I'm just going to mention, you did mention evolution.
Yeah.
Evolutionary theories like Darwinism and also philosophical evolutionism has this idea that there's no fixed nature.
Yes.
Everything's fluid. Whereas Aristotle held this idea of fixity of nature. You don't have one thing changing into another thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
On that point, just as a minor point, I've done a bit of reading about it. I tried to decide whether evolution was true or false, and you read into these things and you get into these arguments and you think, oh, it's too much. I can't. I'm not going to work it out. So my children ask me, and I say, well, it's complicated, but I think there are very good arguments against evolution. What was my point? My point is I believe there is such a thing as microevolution. So things do adapt, change in the environments over time. Species do, but that doesn't mean they change from one species to another, or one fundamental kind of animal to another.
What's an example of microevolution?
Well, the shapes of birds' beaks.
Survival of the fittest kind of thing. But that 6 fingers could be a survival of the fittest. If we all wanted to be excellent pianists and we were breeding to be pianists, that would become normal. So
Well,
I didn't really understand that analogy from that regard.
My point in that regard is that from Aristotle's point of view, and I think we should adopt that view as well, your concept of what is normal is dictated by concept of what does it mean to flourish as a human being? What does it mean for a human being to develop, And in Aristotle's concept, physically speaking, a normal human being would normally have 5 fingers on both hands. And that's the standard. And then you can use that as a measure of other things and say, well, that's an abnormality. But if you don't have teleology, you don't have a concept of what an ideal human being would be in the body, then you're right. That would be normal because it would be adaptive, it would be statistically in the majority, and so forth.
And that's when the transhumanism thing comes in, because then, well, why not chop your arm off and put it on a better mechanical one?
Yeah. Yeah. How long have we got now? Please.
20 past, right?
10 minutes left?
20 past that, yeah.
All right. So I'll sum up this Aristotle part, and then I'll just summarize what Aquinas adds. And then we can have a bit of a discussion. So just put this aside now. We'll just focus on this substance-accident distinction. So Aristotle goes looking for a concept of being that can encompass all ways of being, but he was also interested in what's primary. So with the substance-accident distinction, he can say substance is primary, and form and substance for him are pretty much the same thing. Accident is secondary. So the concept of being does have a unity. Being is a unified concept. And the concept works as an analogy. Analogy for him means it's got sufficient complexity that it can accommodate these differences between substance and accident, but there's an order to those differences, and the order is that substance is primary and accident is derivative. The example that's always given in Aristotle and then in Aquinas is the word healthy. So let's think of a few different sentences in which we would say the word healthy, the adjective healthy. We would say eating apples is healthy. We could say my skin is healthy. We could say that run was a healthy run. And we could say my body's healthy or I'm healthy. Okay, now one of those senses of healthy is the primary one. We could also say, well, urine is healthy, right? But which one's primary? Well, the primary sense of healthy is that my body is healthy, or I'm healthy. And apples are healthy because they are conducive to the health of my body. Urine is healthy because it's a sign that my body is healthy. Okay? So you can see how the same word or the same concept, it's flexible, but it all comes back to the same point. All the different applications and senses of the word all refer back to the primary sense of the word. I'll repeat that. All the different senses of the word healthy, healthy urine, healthy running, healthy skin, healthy food, healthy eating, healthy habits, they all refer back to the primary sense of healthy, which is having a healthy body. Okay? So just think of that logical structure. You've got different senses of this word, healthy, but they all come back to a center. They're not just unrelated, random, different senses of word. And that's what he means by this pros-hen unity and analogy. I'm not sure whether Aquinas uses it in exactly the same way, this word analogy, but this is how Aristotle does it. And so his concept of being is analogy in this sense. It's pros-hen, meaning it comes back to one, toward one. So his notion of being is this flexible one that it comes back to this primary sense, substance. And there's something else, something similar is going on here. Actuality is primary. There's that. That's Aristotle. Aristotle's Metaphysics. How long have you got to summarize Aquinas' Metaphysics?
7 minutes.
Okay. So, in the actuality, potentiality comes to be known as act and potency. As far as I'm aware, they mean exactly the same thing. Yeah, I haven't noticed any difference. This is the word when followers of Aquinas and followers of Aquinas do philosophy, they tend to use this more. So this is one of the fundamental building blocks of Aquinas' metaphysics. He's getting this from Aristotle. And I'll use the Latin actually. So essentia means essence. And the essence of the thing basically is form. If it's a material thing, it will have matter as well. When we talk about the essence of human being, we're talking about matter in a general way. So the essence of a human being is to have a soul and a body. We wouldn't say the essence of a human being is to have a soul and this body or this flesh. It's just flesh in general, okay? So, an essence is, think of it like this, it's a way of being, determinate way of being. humanity or humanness is a way of being, horseness is a way of being, being a rose is a way of being, okay, being an angel, a specific angel, an individual angel is a way of being. But when we contemplate just that idea, we don't know whether it exists or not. And in fact, it's a contingent fact whether that thing exists or not. It might have never existed, and in the future it might pass out of existence. For everything except God, so all creatures, you've got an essence which may or may not exist. And whether it exists depends on the will of God, basically. The essence, if God is sustaining it in being, it exists. If God is not sustaining it in being, it doesn't exist. Alright? So that fact of existing has to be given to it. It doesn't exist independently, it has to receive existence. Now, see how this is different to Aristotle. Aristotle doesn't do this. What's interesting about Aristotle is that he doesn't really have a notion of God giving things existence. I think that's related to the fact that for him the world just exists eternally. It always was and always will be. And the forms just always were. They're always embodied in time, and then God didn't create them, they just was always there. And you just got one generation giving that specific form to the next, and it just goes on. From Aquinas' point of view, that doesn't explain where those forms came from, and it doesn't explain existence. So Aquinas says, no, Aristotle didn't. He missed something out. He missed this. So esse is a very loose translation, is existence, but you have to think of this more like an energy or a dynamism in a thing. The way I try and think of it is it's like life, right? Well, for a living thing, its existence is life. It's the same thing. So if you start with living things, it can make more sense. For a living thing, for it to exist is to have this life principle in it, and that's an energy. And out of that energy comes its growth, all its operations, and so forth. So esse is existence, but taken as this inner dynamic principle or energy. Existence also has this more neutral sense. Now, when we say that the chair exists, it's just either it exists or not. Aquinas goes a step deeper and says, well, there is a metaphysical energy going on in that chair. Bad example. There is an energy going on in that plant. And that's what accounts for its existence. See how there's a difference between saying that something exists, which is one thing, everyone does that, and the philosophical move, which is saying that there's this energy, this esse in it, this dynamism, and then saying, well, that's the foundation of its existence. Well, that is its existence. So, I guess I've got 5 minutes left now, or 2 minutes.
No, you don't actually.
I'll just finish off another 2 minutes. So essentia, essence is, it gives a determinate shape to esse. So when the act of being, this principle combines with essence, the essence is making it be in a determinate way. So, like a horse or like a human being or like a plant. But essay is actualizing the essence. So there's sort of this reciprocal. This is really, really hard to get my head around still. You've got these two principles, but they're not agents. They're not these independent agents acting on each other. But there's two principles. You've got essay, that's actualizing the essence. And you've got the essence giving shape or determinate nature to the essay, and they're combined. And when they're combined, you've got a thing existing with a certain nature. And the relationship between those two is act and potency. And for Aquinas, God is just pure essay. There's no potency. God does have an essence, but the essence is the same, exactly the same as his existence. And what that means is he exists necessarily. His existence can't be removed from him. The end.
I was going to just mention, you talked about participation, and just tying it in what you said just then, because in God, as you said, his essence is the same as his essay, but in everything else, in every other being, it's made up of essence plus essay, and that essay is participated essay from God. God is the one who gives, as you said, the essay to different things. They have different essences. They participate in that essence, yes.
Yeah. That's where the
Oh, their essay, yes, in God's essay. Yes.
That's where the participation bit comes in. So, just to try and, there was a thread I had before. I said that he takes Aristotle and adds the participation part, and that's where participation comes in.
Sorry, Brendan.
Yeah.
Question first, kind of going back a bit.
Yeah.
When you were saying about, 2 plus 2, not like God won't make it equal 5.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, just thinking about what you've been saying, is it better to say that it's not that God doesn't have the power to do it, but that he wouldn't do it because then he wouldn't be perfectly simple? Like he's already determined what 2 plus 2 is going to equal 5, and because he is pure act, like he's not going to change his mind and like act against himself to.
Yeah, that's an interesting way. That's an interesting move. What you're saying, I'm going to mirror back what I think you're saying. So, God has decided that, and I'm going to sort of put a theological hat on now. God's decided that there's grace in the sacraments, right? I mean, he might have decided not to do it that way. He could have arranged things a different way. He could have had a different economy of grace, but he's done that. And he's decided that from all eternity. And he doesn't just arbitrarily change his mind about these things. God doesn't work like that. So we can rely on the fact that God doesn't change. God doesn't arbitrarily change his mind. And that's why because God is unified like that, we can be extremely confident that there's always going to be grace in the sacraments for us. But I don't think the analogy works. I'm saying something stronger, which is that you could say that God might have arranged things differently, but didn't, in terms of the sacraments, or whether Christ came, or whether Christ didn't die for us, but he just suffered it. These are alternative possibilities, which I think Aquinas would say could have happened, but I don't think he'd say God could have made 2 plus 2 equal 5. He couldn't have done that. And I think your worry about that is it seems to say that God is limited in his power.
Well, I guess it's not so much that, it's more I'm just sort of wondering about, like, is it the right sort of question? Like, I mean, though I guess it also, when you're saying that we're just making up a nonsensical question that doesn't even have a proper answer anyway, so, like, as in, like, 2 plus 2 can't equal 5 because it's nonsense, not because it's actually a
limitation.
Well, what Aquinas says is that because God can't do something that's intrinsically impossible, that's not a limitation. God can't make himself, he can't annihilate himself. But that's not a limitation. Because all the things that are intrinsically possible, God can do.
So what about men who want to be women? So God can't do that. I mean, like, it's impossible.
Ooh, that's a big one. Could God do that? Well, just my immediate instinctive response to that. Well, we know the way that God has arranged things. He doesn't want human beings attempting to change sex. And we know that the way that he has arranged the natural order of things, you can't actually do it. It's impossible to do. Your question, though, could God have made it possible to people to change?
I'm saying that that's an analogy for the 2 plus 2, it can't equal 5.
It's similar.
And without truth. Because God is truth, and so he can't, he wouldn't contradict himself.
See, 2 plus 2 equals 5 is dealing with an impossibility. So, as you said, Sir Thomas says, God can't do the impossible. Because the impossible is non-being. Mm-hmm. Like, if God can't make a square circle, it's impossible. So that's not a limitation of his power, because God only can do what can act on being and cause being, not non-being. So the impossible is non-being.
For a man to become a woman, if that were possible, that would mean that you'd have to be fundamentally. Because let's think about this, how Aristotle would think of that. Through any change, something has to be the same, right? If you're going to say a man becomes a woman, you have to say that fundamentally you're this sexless thing and you're accidentally male and then you become accidentally female. Put it like this, if I'm essentially male, if I become essentially female, that is not the same person, it can't be. Because you can't change your essence. The same thing can't change its essence, it's impossible.
But the question is the sexuality of a human in the order of substance or accident?
That's a big one. I don't know how to answer that.
It's probably more correct to say it's in the order of accident, but it's an important accident, but it's in the accidental order rather than the substantial order, because whether you're male or female, you're substantially human. Your sexuality is in the order of accident, I would say.
This is I have a question for you then, Father. Does that mean the soul has got no sex, no sex? Well, angels don't have a sex, right? Is it like this? The soul hasn't got a sex, and then it's only got a sex because it's in the body.
It's through the union in matter, I think.
Yeah. So the other view would be God creates this male soul and matches it up with a male body, and I don't think that's right.
No.
But when we die, we're not going to become. We're still going to be the same person.
Because we've lived in our body.
So then your soul.
All of our memories and actions come with us, which work through the body. So, yeah.
God doesn't create the soul and then implant it in a body. He, at the same time, creates the soul and with the body. It's not no pre-existence. So it's once he creates it with the matter, and joins it with the matter, that matter determines the soul in a certain sense.
Wouldn't you think though that the sex is actually part of the actual, because it's what happens created them male and female. So you're male and female, isn't that sort of part of being human, one or the other?
It's not, well, that, again, whether it's essential that you are male or female to being a human, I think you could make a case that it's not essential to be a human to be either male or female.
I think so. I think there'd be Thomists who would take different views on that.
Yeah, very different.
And I think Aristotle talks about there are certain properties or predicates that apply to just the soul, and others that apply to the soul-body composite. And I think you could say sex belongs essentially to the composite. That's how I would answer the question.
Original sin has to be taken into consideration. That does create aberrance. When you look at hermaphrodites, for example, one with both genders, that's a consequence of original sin. It's not something that God intended for created species. That does create a conundrum, but it's definable by means of the consequence of sin, original sin. You can't answer this purely on the level of humanity and genetics or sex or gender.
It's a hard one because we don't want to say that hermaphrodites are inhuman or that they're not in God's image, because they are.
Just like cancer is a consequence of sin. In the Garden of Eden, cancer wouldn't have existed. There wouldn't have been Down syndrome. There would have been all sorts of aberrants that are consequence natural of original sin or our own sin or ancestral sin.
Well, I mean, the resurrection of the body, we're all going to have perfect bodies in heaven. That's reality. So if someone's trying to be a woman who was born a man, well, the resurrection will be, if they were born a man, they'll be a man in heaven.
I would assume so, yeah.
So I can't see how you could possibly separate it. Like, souls are female and male, wouldn't they be? They're the resurrected body, which will last for eternity. It's only going to be a man or a woman.
But then the soul, though, is the soul of the person, and the person only exists when the body and the soul are together. So, like, after I die, my soul, where it goes next, it's the soul of Marie Hasten. For that, it doesn't need to be, the soul itself doesn't need to be female, does it? It's enough that it's my soul.
Middle bit, haven't you? When you haven't resurrected your body, you've died, you've gone to heaven, but your body's not there yet.
Yeah, the body's female.
Soul is comprised of intellect and will, is that right? It doesn't not comprise of gender.
No, because intellect and will are powers that flow from the soul. The soul has got intellect and will, yeah.
The gender is contingent upon XY chromosomes of one physical.
There's no chromosomes in the soul, so I didn't hear.
No, gender is a consequence of chromosomes. Soul is not reliant upon, surely, chromosomes.
You see, Aristotle talks about material causes. Aristotle might say the material cause of gender is the chromosomes, but maybe there's some form cause of it. I don't know.
Otherwise, if you've had, babies that never actually lived outside the womb, but we believe them to have a soul, does that mean that they act genderless in heaven? If we said before that the effect of gender is as a result of our experience within the body, our memories, our thoughts, our behaviours, sex. If they haven't actually experienced,
And they still had a sex even if we didn't.
Yeah.
Transgender is like a social construct.
It's not from experience. It's the fact that when it's joined, when the soul is united to matter, it becomes then it attains a sexuality, a gender. It's as that either male or female. It's not from the experience.
Perhaps saying in a bit of a practical way back to that original question, can God change males to females or vice versa? If maybe he can, nonetheless he isn't. Like the people who are claiming that they have changed, God is not been involved.
Yeah, and so there's two different ways of answering the question. You can talk about what God might have been able to do, or you can become more humble and just say, well, we know what God is doing and what his actual intention is for us.
I suppose that also becomes a bit easier because you can look at nature and see there are some animals which like during their lifespan can swap from like male to female usually. But like, so we see that technically it is possible in nature, but obviously yeah, it's not what God intended for us. So
Yeah, and when people point out that, you know, there's homosexual activity in the animal kingdom, I just point out, well, animals eat each other.
God has created ambiguous genitalia, humans with ambiguous genitalia and with hermaphrodites of both genders, and I'm not suggesting that that's the case for everyone who's wanting to change their gender these days, but he has created them, and you know, whether we say that this is a consequence of original sin or whether he intended it that way, ultimately I think we shouldn't really be thinking about what other people's personal situations are. It's too much focus on other people's awful situations and judgment.
You're saying we're dealing too much with those difficult borderline cases, we should just worry about...
No, those borderline cases exist is what I'm saying, and not everybody who has that situation is gender confused or believing that it's some social construct. They actually have been born with horrific situations of no genitals or both genitals. It's just something that is horrific for them, and they've been put into a box of some socialized leftism. But, that's all.
Yeah, there's something I saw the other day. What was it? Sorry, it's lost me. But something I watched. It's very easy to forget that we're called to be, you know, just compassionate and treating people as human beings. When we're in these culture wars, you know, it's easy to forget that.
So the chromosomes determine this, the sexuality. That's normally the accepted. So you're XY, you're a male, or XX female. Now there could be some. I'm not sure the exact genetics here, but whether there can be some variation in that.
I had a friend who you would, by looking at him, you would say, well, male. There's no question he was male. That's what's called the phenotype, how someone presents. But genotypically, he was two X's and a Y.
Finish with a prayer.
Yeah, after all that, into the prayer. Do you want to do the prayer?
And the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank
Thank you, Brendan.